Trump called the Pope terrible, and the Pope fired back. Here's what nobody's telling you. Here's the wild part. This isn't even the first time the courts have tried to shut this down. They already did it once, and now the administration came back with a different law, a different argument, and a move that legal experts are calling something no president in American history has ever attempted before. If what they're arguing holds up, the president, any president, could unilaterally tax nearly every product coming into this country at virtually any time for virtually any reason forever if it doesn't hold up. One of the most aggressive economic agendas in modern American history gets kneecapped by 9 words written into a law that most people have never heard of, from 1974. Either way, you need to understand what's happening right now. Hold on. Before we go any further, if nobody in your life is telling you this, breaking down not just what happened, but why it matters, who it affects, and what comes next, that's exactly why this channel exists. Hit subscribe right now. NationPulse exists so everyday people have a seat at the table when decisions this big get made. You deserve to know this. Hit subscribe so you never miss what they don't want you to understand. All right, let's get into it. Let's rewind just a little bit, because to understand today, you have to understand the last few months, because this story has been building like a pressure cooker. Back in February of this year, the Supreme Court of the United States stepped in and blocked President Trump from using a law called IEEPA. That's the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, to impose what became known as his Liberation Day tariffs. These were sweeping, aggressive tariffs on goods coming in from countries all over the world. The idea was simple. America has been getting a bad deal in global trade for decades, and the president wanted to use emergency powers to fix it fast. But the Supreme Court said, not so fast. The way IEEPA was being used went too far. And just like that, one of the most talked about economic policies in years got frozen. Now here's where most people would stop, pack it up, go back to Congress and try to do it the traditional way, introduce legislation, hold hearings, build a coalition, take months or years, the slow road. That's not what happened. Instead, the administration reached back into the legal toolbox and pulled out something that almost nobody was talking about. Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, a law so old, so rarely used that most trade lawyers had to look it up, and they said, we can still do this. Different law, same tariffs. That's what Friday's hearing was all about. A 3-judge panel sitting on the U.S. Court of International Trade in Manhattan spent nearly 2 hours tearing into the government's argument. And based on what happened in that room, the administration is in serious trouble. Okay, let's slow down here, because this is the most important part, and I'm going to make it as simple as possible. Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974 was written during a very specific moment in American economic history. Think about what 1974 looked like. You had the oil crisis, you had inflation spiraling, you had the dollar under pressure on international currency markets. Congress was watching the U.S. economy get squeezed from the outside, and they wanted to give the president a tool, a fast emergency tool, to respond to one very specific kind of crisis. That crisis is called a balance of payments problem. Now, balance of payments sounds complicated. It's not. Here's how to think about it. Imagine you're a family. Every month, you're spending more money buying stuff from other families than those families are spending buying stuff from you. Over time, that gap, the difference between what's flowing out of your wallet and what's flowing in, starts to affect how much your money is actually worth. Banks start to worry. Investors start to hedge. The whole system gets wobbly. That's a balance of payments crisis. And in 1974, Congress said, if that specific emergency hits, the president can slam on the brakes. He can impose an emergency tariff up to 15% for up to 150 days while Congress figures out a longer-term solution. That's what Section 122 was built for, a pressure valve, a short-term emergency patch. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The Trump administration looked at that law and said, we have persistent trade deficits with countries all over the world. That's a balance of payments problem. Therefore, Section 122 applies, and the president has the authority to impose these tariffs. Simple, right? Not so fast. When government attorney Brett Shumate stood up in front of that 3-judge panel and started laying out the administration's argument, the judges were not gentle. One of them leaned in with a question that cut right to the heart of everything. And I want you to sit with this question, because it's the one that could end this entire legal theory. Are you really saying that a large trade deficit alone is sufficient? And then, this is the part that should send a chill down the spine of anyone rooting for this tariff policy. The judge didn't wait for a full answer. He added, I don't think it is, and I think Congress didn't think it is. That's a judge essentially telling the government's own lawyer, I've already read the law, I've already made up my mind about what it means, and what you're arguing, it doesn't fit. Now, Shoemate pushed back. He argued that Congress gave the president broad discretion, that it's not the court's job to second-guess how the executive branch interprets economic conditions. He pointed to other factors the administration cited, not just the trade deficit itself, but the current account deficit, something called the net international investment position, and a whole list of other economic indicators. His message was essentially, the president looked at the whole picture, made a call, and the law gives him the power to do that. But the challenger's lawyer, a man named Jeffrey Schwab, fired back with a phrase that is going to stick in this case for a long time. He said the government's theory was, quote, very, very, very broad. And he warned the court that if they accepted it, the president could act at any point, at any moment that he wants forever. Think about that. Forever. I need to stop right here and zoom out because I think a lot of the coverage of this story is missing the forest for the trees. People hear tariff ruling and they think, okay, prices might go up or down. The stock market will react. There'll be a tweet and then we'll all move on. No. What is being decided in this courtroom and ultimately in courts above it, because this is absolutely going to the appeals court and very likely back to the Supreme Court, is something much bigger than any single tariff policy. This is a fundamental question about the separation of powers in the United States of America. Here's what I mean. The Constitution gives Congress, not the president, the power to regulate trade. It says so in plain language. Article 1, Section 8. Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, and imposts. That means tariffs. That means Congress. But over the decades, going all the way back to the mid-20th century, Congress has gradually handed pieces of that power to the executive branch. They passed laws like IEPA, like Section 232, like Section 301, that gave the president authority to act on trade in specific situations. The theory was, the president can respond faster to economic emergencies than a slow-moving Congress can. For years, presidents used those powers modestly. They were surgical, targeted, limited to specific countries or specific products. Then everything changed. What the current administration has done, and what these court cases are now forcing judges to confront, is push those delegated powers to their absolute outer limit. And the question the courts have to answer is, did Congress ever actually intend to hand that much power to a single person? Because if the answer is yes, if Section 1 and 22 really does give the president unlimited authority to impose tariffs whenever he decides there's a balance of payments issue, then effectively one person controls the trade policy of the entire United States. No vote, no debate, no checks. And if the answer is no, if the courts say Congress meant something much narrower, something much more specific back in 1974, then the president's ability to use emergency trade powers as a broad economic tool gets sharply curtailed. And not just for this administration, for every administration that comes after it. This is a generational legal fight, and it's happening right now. Now let's talk about who is actually bringing these challenges to court, because it's not just some random activist group. 24 state attorneys general joined together to file suit against the administration over the Section 122 tariffs. 24. That is a massive coalition representing a huge swath of the country. And their core argument is sharp. They say the administration's move to Section 122 after the Supreme Court blocked IEPA is not a legitimate legal pivot. It's a workaround. It's the executive branch essentially saying the Supreme Court blocked our first door, so we're going through the side window. The AGs are arguing that you cannot use an emergency provision to do the same thing a court just told you that you couldn't do under a different emergency provision. That's not how the law works. You don't get to shop for legal theories until you find one that sticks. Now, the administration's response, and this is actually an interesting argument, is that both laws were always available. IEPA and Section 122 are separate tools with separate legal foundations. Just because you used IEPA first doesn't mean Section 122 is off the table. They're not mutually exclusive. And technically, they might be right about that on a pure statutory level. The problem is the optics, and more than the optics, the underlying intent. When a court looks at what the administration is doing, they're not just reading the words of the law. They're asking, what is the real purpose here? Is this a genuine emergency response? Or is this creative legal maneuvering to accomplish through the courts what voters in Congress haven't signed off on? That question about intent is going to be one of the most important things the judges wrestle with going forward. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough when we cover these legal fights. The president's own words matter enormously. When you're a president invoking emergency powers, you are making a legal declaration. You're saying, I am invoking this emergency provision because the following conditions exist. And those conditions and the president's characterization of them become part of the legal record that courts examine. President Trump has been vocal, to say the least, about his tariff goals. He's talked about using them to raise revenue. He's talked about using them as leverage in negotiations. He's talked about bringing manufacturing back to America. He's framed them as part of a massive economic restructuring effort. None of those goals, not one of them, is what Section 122 was written to address. Section 122 was written for a currency crisis, a balance of payments emergency, a situation where the dollar itself was under immediate threat of collapsing in value, not for long-term trade strategy, not for revenue generation, not for manufacturing policy. So when challengers argue that the administration is misusing the law, they don't have to prove it just with legal theory. They can point to the president's own statements and say, listen to what he's actually saying these tariffs are for. Does that sound like a balance of payments emergency to you? Courts have used exactly this kind of reasoning before. And it's one of the reasons the administration's legal position here is genuinely risky. I want to make sure we don't lose the plot here because all this legal back and forth can feel abstract. Let me bring it back to something concrete. These tariffs, the ones being fought over in court right now, are a 10% tax on goods coming into the United States from most of America's trading partners. 10% across the board. That might sound small. It is not small. Think about everything you buy that comes from somewhere else. Electronics, clothing, groceries, auto parts, building materials, medical equipment. The supply chains for most of what Americans consume are global, and a 10% tariff doesn't just add 10% to the cost of the imported product. It ripples through every step of the supply chain. It gets absorbed, passed along, built into prices at every level until it lands finally in the price tag you see at the store. Economists across the political spectrum have warned about this. Some support tariffs as a long-term strategy to rebuild domestic production, even if there's short-term pain. Others say the pain falls disproportionately on working-class Americans who spend a higher share of their income on the kinds of goods most affected by import taxes. What everyone agrees on is this: tariff policy at this scale changes the economy. It changes what companies make, where they make it, who they hire, and at what wages. It changes what goods are available on shelves and at what prices. It changes the trade relationships that the U.S. has built with allies and competitors over decades. This is not a footnote to the news. This is the news. And whether these tariffs stand or fall, whether the courts uphold the president's authority or rip it away, the answer is going to shape economic policy in this country for years. So what happens now? Let's map it out. The Court of International Trade in Manhattan heard arguments on Friday. Based on the skepticism the judges showed during those nearly 2 hours of arguments, most legal analysts are expecting the panel to rule against the administration, likely blocking the Section 122 tariffs, just as the Supreme Court blocked the IEEPA tariffs before them. If that happens, the administration will almost certainly appeal. The case would go to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, which has jurisdiction over cases involving international trade. And from there, if the administration loses again, it goes back up to the Supreme Court. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because the Supreme Court already weighed in once, blocking the IEEPA tariffs. The composition of the court, the legal questions being raised, all of it suggests that when Section 122 eventually arrives at 1 First Street in Washington, D.C., the justices are going to have to draw a much clearer line than they've ever drawn before about how much trade authority Congress can delegate to the president and under what conditions the president can use it. That ruling, whenever it comes, will be one of the most significant separation of powers decisions in a generation. It will be studied in law schools. It will be cited in cases for decades, and it started in a Manhattan courtroom on a Friday afternoon. This case is also, and I cannot stress this enough, completely unprecedented. President Trump is the first president in American history to attempt to use both IEEPA and Section 122 to unilaterally impose tariffs. There is no roadmap for this. There is no prior case that perfectly answers the questions being raised. The courts are genuinely writing new law as they go, which means the outcome is genuinely uncertain and genuinely consequential. I want to leave you with something that I think is more important than any single tariff or any single court ruling. We talk a lot in this country about the checks and balances built into the Constitution, about how no branch of government is supposed to have unchecked power, about how Congress makes the laws, the president enforces them, and the courts make sure the rules are followed. But here's the reality. Those checks and balances only work if each branch is willing to actually check the others. For decades, across multiple presidencies, both Republican and Democrat, Congress has been quietly, gradually, sometimes willingly, sometimes through inaction, giving away its power. Every time they pass a law with a broad emergency clause, every time they decline to pass legislation that would rein in executive authority, every time they let a president act unilaterally rather than doing the hard work of building legislative consensus, they are trading their constitutional power for convenience. And now the courts are being asked to figure out how much of that trade was legal, how much of what Congress handed to the president was theirs to give, how much discretion is too much discretion. That is the question underneath all of this. Not, are tariffs good or bad? Not, is this president right or wrong? But who is supposed to have this power in the first place? That question is as old as the Republic. It has been fought over since the very first year George Washington sat in the presidency. And the answer, the real answer, has never been permanently settled. It gets relitigated in every era, in every crisis, with every new president who tests the limits of what the executive branch can do. We are living through one of those moments right now. And whether you think these tariffs are the best thing that ever happened to American workers or the most economically reckless policy in modern history, that question of who has the power, who should have the power, and what the courts are willing to do about it, that question matters to all of us equally, because it isn't just about tariffs. It never was. It's about the structure of American democracy itself. All right, Nation Pulse, that is where we are. A 3-judge panel in Manhattan looking skeptical, 24 attorneys general pushing back hard, a legal theory that has never been tried before by any president in American history, a law from 1974 that was never designed for this moment being stretched in ways Congress never imagined, and a fight that is almost certainly heading back to the Supreme Court, with consequences that are going to echo for decades. This story isn't over, not even close. We are going to keep tracking it every step of the way, but here's what I need from you right now. First, if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Hit that subscribe button. This channel exists because people deserve honest, clear, no-spin breakdowns of what is actually happening in government. Not talking points, not spin. The actual story, explained in plain English. If that's what you're looking for, this is your home. Second, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think. Do you believe the president should have this kind of power over trade policy? Should Congress take it back? Do the courts have any business weighing in at all? Let's talk about it. Your voice matters in this conversation. Third, share this video. Send it to one person in your life who is frustrated, confused, or tuned out from politics because they feel like nobody explains it in a way they can actually understand. That's what Nation Pulse is built for. That's exactly who needs to see this. The fight over who controls the American economy is happening right now. In courtrooms, in Congress, in executive orders, in emergency proclamations written in legal language designed to be confusing. We translate it, we break it down, we make sure you understand it. That's the mission.